Good morning. It is a good morning for a change. Welcome to the Bluin Creative Leadership Summit panel on global security and asymmetric risks, which is, I think, in some respects, even the most interesting part of that. I'm David Andelman. I'm the editor of World Policy Journal. There were 70 copies free out there, but they've all been snapped up yesterday. But if you want one, or if you want to know how to find us or whatever, I have a card, and please feel free to come up afterwards. It's a great issue on democracy as our cover theme. And we've chosen, though, here today to focus not really necessarily on democracy, but on global security, certainly, but also on this fascinating concept, which I love, called asymmetric threats. It's an idea that, ironically, perhaps dates back to the late Cold War years, when it was coined in 1975 by Andrew J.R. Mack, who was exploring why big nations lose small wars. A very appropriate point. Ironically, he was referring to Indochina, a war that first the French and then that very year, 1975, the United States lost most decisively. And I was in Cambodia and Laos in those final days to watch that denouement, and it was not a pretty sight, believe me. So today, I hope I'm not in the same position watching the democratic powers of the developed world lose far more complex conflicts with perhaps even larger stakes for the global system. There was a recent Defense Intelligence Agency report that elaborates on two such global threats that seem especially real and immediate, and that I hope we'll get into to a degree from our four wonderful panelists, who we'll get to momentarily. The first of the DIA threats is nuclear, the world having swapped the binary threat of a great power standoff for a multipolar threat that promises to be far more unstable and dangerous, perhaps, in the long run. Although we all live in the immediate, not the long run, but nevertheless, in both situations. Nuclear powers, or wannabe nuclear powers, pitted against more active and deadly forces from the world's most dangerously disenfranchised people, all of them lusting after this ultimate power of the bomb or other weapons of mass destruction. The second set of threats identified by the DIA in this really quite fascinating document is perhaps even more asymmetric, born by economic instabilities, rather pathogens or terrorist attacks that could involve any or all such weapons of challenges. So today, in the next 75 minutes or 70 minutes or so, I hope our distinguished panel will help us arrive at some of the best strategic choices, the best strategic solutions to avoid such conflicts. And it really is, in many cases, choice to arrive at a solution, hopefully. What new defenses, what weapons are most effective? Can they be stemmed by international cooperation, by diplomacy alone, by economic weapons? Boycotts seem to be the most often invoked, the most popular, sort of style nowadays, the a la mode, if you will, though perhaps it might also be the least effective. So we'll explore perhaps some of those issues. What alliance systems do we construct? Are they appropriate? Do they work in this kind of a situation in a world like we are facing today with these asymmetric threats, or even binary threats such as United States and China, for instance, perhaps Iran and Israel, Iran and Saudi Arabia? How can we count on those systems, these alliance systems such as they are, when it really counts? What challenges do the defenses we choose pose to our own way of life and the freedoms that we cherish? And above all, how can we avoid distractions from the ultimate threat, a nuclear Iran? Now, we got into that a little bit yesterday morning. Some of you may have been at our Middle East panel where we dealt to a degree with that and many other instabilities in the Middle East. But we respond to the more immediate crises of the moment while ignoring the crisis of the medium term, probably, and that's what happens if and when Iran does become a member of the nuclear club. So today the Bluin Summit has assembled a blue ribbon panel, and now I'll ask each of them to spend just a couple of minutes. We've already been through the regime, and I'm pretty rigorous in enforcing these things. We don't want long monologues at the beginning. We want us all to have a wonderful discussion among ourselves, and then hopefully open it up to you folks. Introducing themselves and offering their own targeted prescription to the challenges we've defined. So why don't I begin on my far right, no political pun intended, with Angela, and please introduce yourselves, and then you're on.
Thank you very much. I am Angela Kane. I'm the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations, and we have been given strict instructions to spend 2 minutes. Now, you know, at the United Nations, we never really do very well with short speeches, but I will try my best.
Well,
and maybe
I have to say, at CBS, we used to say you can tell the history of the end of the world in 2 minutes, and if you have to, they'll get it down to 1:45 on the evening news. So.
But I think that when I think about the subject, which is a very challenging one, and of course one that falls right into my remit, I think that we are at a very familiar crossroads. And as before, the roads obviously don't go in one direction, but they actually is a fork in the road. And to my mind, these forks in the road begin with the syllable in. And the first one, in my mind, is instability. You already referred to the Middle East, and we go into that maybe a little bit later. But we see it in the headlines about impending and actual financial collapses. We see it in demonstrations throughout the Middle East. We see in arms races underway in at least 3 regions. We see it in maritime territorial disputes. And we also see a chronic stalemate, and I must say a chronic stalemate, efforts to eliminate weapons of mass destruction, but also to limit conventional arms. The next fork in the road is called innovation, and the other one is interdependence. Responses to weapon threats have been accompanied by innovations in verification and safeguards technologies, such as the ability to detect nuclear explosions in any environment, and I'm sure that Tibor Todt will talk about that. But as people communicate more, invest more, travel more, purchase more from other countries, they also develop a common interest in actually avoiding war. And this is something which I believe we need to build on. I think nuclear weapons, to my mind and to many others, pose the gravest threat to humanity, and therefore it poses the gravest threat to stability because of the massive and indiscriminate effects from the use of even one such device. I think when you hear about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you always hear about the physical destruction, but it is very stark to see actually what happens to people when they are affected by the nuclear explosion. Non-proliferation and counterterrorism efforts are important, but they will not be sufficient to prevent another use of nuclear weapons. A real solution is the only one, and that requires successful process of disarmament, and I mean nuclear disarmament. This will require very concrete deeds and very concrete steps. In particular, deeds rooted in domestic laws, in policies, and in institutions. There will be hope for eliminating weapons of mass destruction as soon as agreed multilateral norms covering such weapons are fully integrated into government structures and embraced as national priorities. This does not mean the end of the nation state, but it will require rehabilitating the ends of the nation state. And once this challenge is met, and domestic goals and policies are brought into line with international commitments and norms, many of the most intractable problems in international organization will disappear. Here is where I hope to see the greatest innovation in the years ahead, and that is by bringing into alignment domestic and global laws, policies, and priorities. And that is what I mean by interdependence, and that is what we need most right now, and that is the interdependence of the global and the local. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Let me first of all, absolutely. That's okay. That's my first line. I am an ambassador, which means it's more an occupation than a profession. It's quite fluffy. I spent quite a number of years with A, B, and C, A meaning atomic, B, biological, C, chemical, 15 years with each. How they add up, I started in the kindergarten. I would like to, first of all, explain the angle I'm coming from. I am the head of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. So we are trying to keep the genie of nuclear explosions in the bottle. I do not want to speak in that capacity because some of the points I put forward I cannot even myself agree with. Risks, that's the issue I would like to mention from the point of view of the nuclear test bans. An intersection of the risk nuclear weapons and explosions are representing, and another risk, Fukushima is a good example, where a safety problem, or it could be a security problem, or whichever S we use, can lead to transboundary issues. So for me, it's like a risk with an X and with a capital X, a very big one, and probably XXL because of the technologies which are involved. Another angle I'm coming from is how far we are able and ready to see those risks, to process with our political brain those risks, or how far we are what might be called in denial. There's a more eloquent phrase for that, cognitive dissonance. So we might be in a collective cognitive dissonance about these risks. There is a feeling that this time is different, using the title of Ken Rogoff about the financial crisis which come back with a certain periodicity. It's very much on those two risks I mentioned, posed by nuclear weapons or posed by big calamities like Fukushima. We do not see that it will happen now. Definitely we do not think that it will happen here. And what is more definite, we do not think that it will happen to us. So I'd like to speak about these issues later on.
Okay, thank you. Madam.
Thank you very much. My name is Patricia O'Brien. I'm the Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs at the United Nations and the United Nations Legal Council. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much. It's an honor to have the opportunity to speak to you. You won't be surprised to hear that I'm going to focus on the legal tools and on ways for effective prevention and response to threats that we face in today's world. Firstly, I'd like to briefly introduce the concept, our principle of responsibility to protect, which predominantly focuses on the prevention of international crimes caused by conflicts and security challenges. And secondly, I'm going to speak about our efforts to bring about an age of accountability through combating impunity for international crimes. So in the past year and a half, the principle of responsibility to protect has come to the front and center as never before. The principle was unanimously affirmed by 150 heads of state and government who embraced the concept in 2005 at the World Summit, which declared that each individual state has the responsibility to protect its own populations from war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing, and that the international community has a responsibility to assist states to protect their populations from these crimes. So at the heart of responsibility to protect is the recognition that state sovereignty entails responsibility. States have a responsibility to protect their populations in the first instance, and building on this responsibility is the positive obligation which is placed on the international community to assist states to meet their obligations and responsibilities and to take early and decisive action where those responsibilities are not met. So this concept cannot succeed without a credible threat of a response and a common conviction that the world no longer tolerates impunity for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. These are the crimes, of course, that shock the conscience of mankind. When responsibility to protect fails, international and national justice must come into play as a logical, natural, and necessary consequence when we fail to protect our populations from these atrocity crimes. In the architecture of international criminal justice, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the international tribunals provide the opportunity and the vehicle for our generation to advance the cause of justice, and in doing so to reduce unspeakable suffering. Last May's judgment by the Special Court for Sierra Leone in the case of Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, was a significant milestone for international criminal justice as it concerned the conviction of a former head of state. So the concept of responsibility to protect, as well as the struggle to end impunity for international crimes and international justice, are important tools for preventing and addressing threats to national and global security. Allow me a last word on the tragic situation in Syria. Syria is a true test of responsibility to protect and the fight against impunity for international crimes. The doctrine of R2P has been at the forefront of the international efforts to address the situation in Syria. It continues to generate immense pressure, not only on the government of Syria, but also on the international community to take effective action, and has increased the moral and political pressure on the members of the Security Council. Further, of course, every perpetrator of international crimes in Syria and elsewhere will come to a day of reckoning. International criminal justice, as we see it, casts its long shadow and threatening shadow over those who commit such crimes. They will, as far as we are concerned, someday be submitted to justice, either national or international. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to engage in the discussion.
Okay, Stefan.
Thanks, David. And having the luxury of being last, I think I'm going to redirect what I was planning to say and actually reflect on some other issues just to broaden the spectrum. And so my name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm Chief of Research at the Markle Foundation. And one of the areas we work in is national security, where we've done mainly work on how to prevent counterterrorism in the past through the development of a new concept of information sharing and re-engineering government. And it's based upon that I will reflect today on the need to actually re-engineer governance on how we go about national security. And just take, for instance, the example of the video that sparked violence in Libya. And of course, the video sparked violence, but was a spark that would not be able to enlighten violence and enlighten the fire of protest if there would not be an environment that was primed for unrest. And so the question here is, how comes that the environment is primed for unrest, and what are the root causes of actually a national security threat like we have seen? And of course, one of the causes is clearly the interconnection that is currently existing that made the video viral in a very quick time, but also the fact that actually protests could be organized using social media in a manner that allowed for agency to happen in a much quicker way, which, by the way, also was used to actually organize protest against dictators. So you have the same technology that also can be used to actually organize violent protests. So that's the interconnectivity is one of the elements that, of course, is quite often driving those kinds of new national security threats. The other one, and there is a lot of actually interesting studies that show that actually food prices was behind the violence, that food prices are actually a critical element that primes our countries for violence, and some have even indicated that actually the Arab Spring would not have happened if the food prices would not have been high. So food prices and food security is clearly another new area of national security. And of course, if you look at food security, how comes we have high food prices? Well, it's linked with global climate change, and it's clearly linked also with energy use, right? Because if we would not have had the drought that we've had, the prices might not have been big. Today in the news, there was a whole article about the fact that Europe will run out of pigs because no one wants to feed the pigs anymore because the price of pig food is so high. So anyway, that is all part of the new national security mix, and add to that also demographics with increased of a youth population that doesn't have work, so in economic unbalance. Add to that also other elements of ideological tension, and so on and so on. So we see that we have a bunch of interlinked root causes in addition to actually those major threats that we already have, which is the nuclear, of course, threat, Iran, and so on. And the problem that we have right now is that all those root causes are being approached from an issue-based approach, i.e. we have individual organizations that look at food. We have individual organizations and groups of communities of experts that look at energy. We have individual organizations that look at interconnectivity and so on. And what is the real challenge in the current environment is to actually have coordination among all those governance organizations, and also have some kind of institutional innovation that allows for information among those organizations to flow freely, to have intelligence that actually informs that there is a likelihood of actually violence in certain areas as a result of those interlinked organizations. And so innovation in institutions based upon coordination and based upon cooperation is highly needed, and anyway, I would just want to add that to the mix of all the distinguished speakers.
Good. Okay, well, thanks. To get this started, and I'd like all of you to chime in, it strikes me that we've set up, between these four very interesting statements, a sort of a dichotomy where, in order to synthesize and perhaps oversimplify, we have the internal threats, and those threats which can be, in theory, laid before a single government or a single institution, a ruling institution, and that can be brought to justice and so on, as Patricia suggested. And then we have that assumes a rational system of some sort. That is a system of governments that, in theory, are responsible for, protecting their own people and so on. Then you have, however, a vast mass of both governments and a few scattered states who seem to be resolutely operating outside these systems. And that's where we come into asymmetric threats. Terrorist groups, for instance, that have, are not really controlled by anyone in particular and answer to nobody except perhaps their own peculiar ideological or religious sympathies. And we witnessed that most recently in Libya. So the question is, how do we guard against, at the one hand and the one extreme, sort of institutional and governmentally posed threats, and on the other hand, truly asymmetric threats by individuals or small organizations that have really no stake in the system whatsoever. And what happens, of course, eventually if one of these groups should get their hands on a weapon of mass destruction. So who wants to begin? Don't all rush forward at the same time. Patricia, I mean, you were the one who sort of brought up the legal issues first. How do you deal on a legal basis with all this?
What strikes me about, certainly in reaction to what you were saying about food security, we are currently at the height of our discussions in the UN about the rule of law and the establishment and development of rule of law. So obviously that's the area that I'm particularly well placed to talk about. And tomorrow, for example, just to mention, we have an extraordinary number of heads of state and government, not tomorrow, it seems like tomorrow, but it's Monday, an extraordinary number of heads of state and government and presidents coming to New York, obviously for the general debate of the General Assembly. But they are arriving early for the purpose of discussing at a high-level meeting on Monday the issue of rule of law. And why is the rule of law important in order to prevent and in order to address these issues of security? It's obvious to most people essentially what the rule of law is, the obligation of states and individuals to be bound by laws that are equally enforced, independently adjudicated, publicly promulgated, and that are compliant with international human rights standards.
But what about those groups that really have no truck with that system?
Well, this is where I'm heading. Just even in the concept of responsibility to protect, which we talk about a lot, and the protection of citizens from the sort of violent crimes that we are seeing being perpetrated around the world. If states truly take the responsibility to protect their populations, that means, amongst other things, including security, in order to prevent the perpetration of these crimes, it needs the establishment of the rule of law. And what that means in practical terms is that states, in the first instance, comply with international legal obligations, such as taking on board their international obligations under treaties, that they sign up to treaties, that they become parties to, for example, the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, all during times of peace, easy to encourage and to possibly get compliance with. But it can't be for a moment underestimated the importance of states putting in place a proper rule of law basis and the institutional framework, etc. Because if there is an appropriate institutional framework and an appropriate application of rule of law in the first instance by states within the states towards their own populations, you won't have a degeneration. I mean, it's a sort of sine qua non, it goes without saying. But it's something that, from my perspective, is an area that we are encouraging, and hopefully Monday will bring about some change in this.
Well, but Tibor, let's look at it from a nuclear perspective, which is, well, both of you should be looking at it from a nuclear perspective. How do you control states, for instance, that have no stake in that? I mean, you have North Korea, you have Iran, which in theory, they've sort of opted out of the international system in a sense in that way. How do you control that? And how do you control then those states in turn becoming perhaps vehicles for the transmission of this technology to individuals or small groups that really have absolutely no stake in the system?
It's not easy. If you take DPRK North Korea, for example, the behavior of North Korea DPRK is not necessarily defined by the rule of law we are creating. So yes, for the last 16 years there is a treaty. Yes, there are 183 countries who at least by signature subscribe to the treaty. Yes, we have a monitoring system which is listening to the hopeful silence of nuclear explosions. But if a country decides to isolate itself, to position itself beyond this boundary, it can happen. It's more a question how the international community is reacting to that. So if it is considered as an unacceptable normal behavior, and yes, you mentioned certain tools like sanctions and these type of tools.
Is that enough in this day and age? Will it work?
I don't believe that there is a silver bullet in the toolbox. Okay, there we have to be a couple of layers where the international community is reacting to the situation, and it cannot be the extreme. Sometimes I call diplomacy, arms control a fluffy thing, but it's a benchmark. But once we benchmark a behavior, there is a need to have the appropriate medicine. And here we cannot think in extremes. The international community cannot mount military action too frequently because of all the political, financial, and other costs. It cannot just rely on the deterrence of arms control, verification, non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament. But we have to apply all the different tools in the toolbox. One point, I would like us to make a step back. Okay, so we are focusing on certain smaller boxes. So I mentioned risk as with a capital X. It's not a pronunciation problem with me, but it's an X factor. Okay?
You're doing very well. And
XXL, the real big threats. And try to imagine a risk matrix, okay? A, atomic, B, chemical, C, B, biological, C, chemical. And then the other side of this matrix is, let's say, security, safety, and what we sometimes call safeguards. That is the non-misuse of technologies. There are 9 different combinations of these. 3 times 3 is 9. And imagine a third dimension of this matrix where it can be a state-on-state problem, it can be a terrorist problem, or it can be a rogue actor, like the 2001 rogue action with anthrax, for example. These are 27 permutations. Still under the nuclear, I did not further speculate whether it's nuclear weapons or fissile material, dirty bomb. Okay? The regime as such, and I see your body language there.
No, I just want to get... Yeah.
This whole system, because it's a system, is as strong as the weakest link in this system. Okay? And what we are speaking here about is one of the 27 boxes in this 3-dimensional matrix, because we are speaking about probably about the T, the terrorists, and we are speaking potentially about like a dirty bomb type of scenario, which is corresponding to this asymmetric notion. But if we neglect the other elements, it's very much like with the financial world, where before 2008 there was an obsession with drug trade, and then because of the ignorance about the danger posed by derivatives, which was called by Warren Buffett the hydrogen bomb of the financial world, everything crumbled.
Okay.
So we have to,
Before we get into that,
think about the 27 boxes.
Let's get dragging Angela into this discussion. She's been waiting very patiently, but with that kind of a scenario of 27 different potential horror stories, if you will, how can we ever hope to move towards real disarmament, which I guess is your goal?
Well, let me go back to what Patricia said, because obviously coming from the UN, you know that we're very strong believers in rule of law and concerted action, and also a consultation among states to willingly adhere, sign, ratify agreements that are in front of them. And I think the Non-Proliferation Treaty is really a very important one. And as Tibor has pointed out, the majority of states belong to it, but there are some that don't. And there are some that are declared nuclear weapon states, and they do not belong to the NPT. And let me just mention two of them, and that's India and Pakistan. There's another one, another state that is never admitted to having nuclear weapons, but is suspected of having nuclear weapons, and that's Israel. And when you come to North Korea, for example, North Korea did belong to the NPT treaty. It withdrew. And why could it withdraw, or why did it withdraw? Because there's a clause in the NPT which says that with giving 3 months' notice, you can actually withdraw. Now,
well,
that
more
is
to the point, even if they weren't, what's to prevent them from doing whatever they want, right?
Well, this is, I think, where we have seen also a bit of a change and not a bit of change. When you look at the earlier treaties that were made, and particularly in disarmament, you didn't have a lot of verification and monitoring in it. I mean, biological weapons, for example. And I think that this is the change where now the transparency, opening up your country for inspections. Iran is a very good case in point, where yes, Iran is a member of the NPT, but has been seen not to comply with the requests or demands by the International Atomic Energy Agency to have those facilities inspected where there are suspected activities. And again, conference building measures opening up to transparency is extremely important. But what would happen, actually, if other states withdrew from the NPT? That sends shivers down my spine. And I also think that pressure should be exerted on states like India and Pakistan that do have nuclear weapons but are not members of the international community. What gives us the confidence that this technology will not be distributed, will not be sold, there will not be cooperation? And that is something where I think we haven't really come to grips with it, because you asked about sanctions. And sanctions, I think, is a very important example. I mean, look at Iran. Iran has tremendous sanctions. There are sanctions by the Security Council. There are sanctions by the European Union. There are financial sanctions which impede their regular financial transactions. I mean, this is enormous. The same on North Korea. I mean, how can we actually say that it has worked? We can't. I can't, from my vantage point. And I think this is something that is extremely important. The other one example that I want to mention is Syria and chemical weapons. There was a statement by a government representative, a high-level government representative, which seemed to admit that they had chemical weapons. Now, there is a chemical weapons convention. Syria has never signed the Chemical Weapons Convention. The only one they signed was the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which prohibits the use of chemical weapons. But again, we cannot verify. We don't know. There's no declaration that they possess it. So to my mind, going back to the rule of law, if we have a sufficiently strong regime of international regulations that member states adhere to, but there has to be also some moral pressure brought on them. But very often, and it's very interesting, if you've read the papers over the last couple of days, you will have seen there's now a debate in the United States about the law of the sea treaty. And why is that? Because the Arctic is melting. So all of a sudden, that would actually give protection to the United States about their shelf, you know, what they can access, etc. So all of a sudden, that question
let's put that on the side and let's move on. One of the things I like to do in a symposia like this is, rather than just simply describe the nature of the problem, is try to suggest where might we be looking for solutions and where might people be looking for solutions, which would be a action step. Stefan, you're a strategist yourself. Where would you begin to look for some of the solutions that we've been raising, of the problems we've been raising here?
All right, thanks for that question. It's very easy. No, it's, well, I mean, I think what I like about this summit is that it is interdisciplinary. And you know, we've had great panels yesterday, some on business, some on cybersecurity and so on. And I think some of the solutions might actually come from what was discussed in the section on how business is changing and where innovation is happening, which is really, of course, a sector that quite often is ignored from a national security community, because it's like the soft sector, and we cannot learn from that. And we are constantly forcing ourselves to cross boundaries as well. And it seems to me that we've reached, indeed, a new environment of collaboration. a new environment of collective intelligence, which, by the way, drives innovation within industry. And if you look at all the promises of big data, for instance, to actually inform decision-making, to make a change in what your dashboard is, to actually decide what the solution should be, we see that there is huge promise. There is still more promise than actually reality, unfortunately, but it seems that that is really a way that the national security sector should look at. I mean, how can you harness the edges? How can you harness collective intelligence in areas where you might have asymmetric threats? Seems to be a key question that needs to be at the table in order to address asymmetric threats. How can you also ensure that you have the data that is now being collected through census and quite often commercial census and a variety of other data collection tools? How can you ensure that actually that data provides for a better dashboard to make decisions? And so on and so on. So it seems to me that part of what the national security sector should do is to really look at what could be new tools of decision making. How can you transform the way we make actually governance decisions? And that doesn't take away, of course, that there are huge challenges with regard to nuclear proliferation. But I do feel that what we hear is that the existing systems are hard and quite often don't really work that well. So the question is, how can we innovate in that?
Well, also, that presupposes players out there that are operating out of some rational framework, and not even a lot of states don't necessarily always operate out of rational frameworks. No, I mean, this is yes.
On this very last point, I don't know whether there is a phrase like bumper cars in the entertainment park. So imagine the difference between an entertainment bumper car type of traffic and the highway, German highway type of traffic. And imagine that there is there a phrase Ghost Rider?
Yes,
okay.
Ghost Rider.
So imagine a Ghost Rider. What is the difference between a Ghost Rider in the bumper car entertainment park and a Ghost Rider on the German highway in the traffic? Okay? And we have to create the traffic rules, and unless we have the traffic rules, and unless we enforce the traffic rules,
but who's going to do that? Who's going to enforce? The Security Council is in a position to do that.
Don't just look at me as a bureaucrat, because I'm a bureaucrat for the international organization, but an international organization can do as much as governments are ready to do. So the step number one is to realize that it's dangerous. There is a high speed out there, and with this A and B and C, all the calamities in the financial world, economic world, it will be a joke compared to that. We will have the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I don't know how much coverage will be there and how much soul searching will be there, but probably under a different scenario and with less amount of luck, because it was sheer luck. Eventually, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we wouldn't have this fancy discussion about the threats and the asymmetry. So number one, to realize that there is a problem out there. To realize not after the calamity is hitting us, as it happened in September 2008, but realize now when still there is time to act. And there was a reference to the dashboard. And since we are with the bumper cars, let's try to use the dashboard. I don't think we have a GPS on all issues. I don't think we know where we are in terms of the 27 boxes in the matrix. Why? Because we don't have indexes. We cannot benchmark them. Okay? So we don't know where we are, we don't know where we should be, and we don't know the speed. These are the three missing elements. The rest we all know.
You know, one problem may be, and yes, and I'll set you up for that, okay? One problem may be that there are simply almost nobody, there's very few people alive anymore who remember or can speak firsthand about what happened the last time a nuclear weapon was used in war, or even in peace. And perhaps that's the problem. No one really understands the game we're playing, the scope of and the horrors that could be unleashed, particularly since those bombs were just, you know, on orders of magnitude smaller than anything that would be unleashed now. No?
Can I share with you?
Well, wait, let's let Angela say.
Let me just say, I was last month. I was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the anniversary of the bombing, and subsequently I saw also a documentary that was produced in this country. And the documentary was excellent, but when you look at the effects of what happened in the bombing, it only showed physical destruction. It didn't show people. And that, to me, was something that was a great glaring gap, because if you actually see the pictures and the documentaries of what happened, it is just really very, very moving. And yes, I agree with you that those people who were affected by the atomic bombing, they are getting very elderly. There are still a few around. But on the other hand, I think that we need to be reminded. Unfortunately, it's always a negative image. And it should be a negative image, but no one really wants to, either in the media, use it or wants to be confronted with it. But I actually wanted to make a different point before you asked me that question. And that is, you asked about solutions. And actually, Stefan already talked a little bit about him. You put him on the spot. I find it very interesting what I've seen in disarmament. I mean, we're talking about a $1.6 trillion expenditure per year. I mean, that is huge. You know, you have to kind of envision the numbers, the zeros behind the trillion. And there was a development quite some years ago to sort of say, how much money could we, if we actually did not spend that amount of money, what could we actually do for development, for the people in our own countries? How much could we help them? What are we actually spending on it? And very often we have something that's called the military expenditures. Of course, military expenditures, you can sort of salami tactic it. You know, like, does it include also health expenditures or insurance, you know, for your troops, etc. But on the other hand, when that didn't really work, because that did not lead to a lessening of the expenditures, there's a new movement that has come up among member states, which I find very important and very interesting. And that is to use international humanitarian law. And that goes back to what Patricia said about responsibility to protect. You actually have a responsibility to protect your own, as a sovereign state, to protect your own populations. And international humanitarian law means you also have a responsibility not to use any weapon that is injurious to people, your own or to others. It is gaining momentum. It is gaining momentum, particularly in the nuclear area. Where it's going to lead to, I don't know, but I have hopes.
Patricia, you wanted to say something?
Thank you. Yes, just picking up on a couple of phrases used, gaining momentum being one of them, and as to pick up on what Stefan was saying, I just think it's very interesting that we haven't touched on global communications and increased media and the effect of the change of media communications that the effect of the change has had on conflict. One thing that has struck us in my office in relation to the Syria discussions and our focus on responsibility to protect is, while, as I've mentioned earlier, in the context of Syria, the difficulty of the Security Council in coming to agreement on particular areas of action is nevertheless, we are still in a very proactive responsibility to protect phase, because the moral and political pressure is there. And the issue that has struck us, in particular in relation to the changed world, is that 30 years ago, President Assad's father, as we all probably in this room are aware, committed terrible atrocities in the Hama massacre, where over 20,000 people were killed. And we looked at our files in my office to see, was there any reference to the Security Council? Was there any discussion, debate in the General Assembly? Were there any, in fact, files in the Secretariat on this issue? Now, of course, there were discussions, but we found nothing. That's 30 years ago. And while the situation in Syria is so difficult, obviously, as we all know, nevertheless, the fact is that the pressure is completely different and the environment is completely different. I, in the first instance, when I looked at this sort of fact and statistic, said, well, this is really an endorsement of the changed views on the responsibility of states in this area. But then, as somebody very promptly pointed out to me, yes, there is that, but it's also the changed reality of the world as we see it now, that there is this communication, that it isn't possible for the individual to escape from the knowledge and acknowledgement of what is going on in the world today. So I think that's just an additional.
Tibor, you had something you wanted to show us.
You asked the question whether there are people who still remember, but there might not be. But Some we might remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. My early childhood first memories related to that. Let me show a video to you. This is different. This is not about
a short video.
Nuclear.
Right?
It's just 2 hours. So 1 minute video.
Okay.
It's about explosions, nuclear explosions, test explosions. After a moratorium in 1958, there was a 2.5 years moratorium, and then somewhere in August 1961, it restarted, and it restarted with a huge explosion carried out by the former Soviet Union. It was called the Tsar bomb, 50 megaton, one device, 4,000 times more devastating than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. What I would like to visualize together with you, if the Cuban crisis did not produce an outcome, a very lucky outcome, you could visualize this video as nuclear weapons use. So let me run this video, because I don't know whether it's on. It's on. This is the moratorium in 1958. There is a silence of nuclear explosions. And then August 1961, some French and Chinese background noises, but in August 1961, hell breaks loose. Is 70 nuclear explosions in 70 months, and at that time there were 3,000 nuclear weapons deployed.
Yeah, so very, very chilling. We're going to go just for a moment, in a moment, to questions from you folks on the floor. But Stefan, did you have one final word you wanted to say? I know you've been sitting patiently there. And
no, I think,
yeah.
Well, one element that I do want to say is also going back to me. It seems the rule of law is a common theme, right? And I think, and I appreciate that a lot, because quite often, when I'm in debates, the rule of law quite often gets cited, and I really appreciate what Patricia did was actually to define what it meant. Because quite often there is a lot of debate about what is the rule of law. And once I brought into those debates, a kind of definitions quite often from the OSCE, who did a lot of work on that in the early days. But there is clearly a need. And I think a lot of that debate is also about how can you actually do a response while protecting civil liberties, which is an issue that we didn't touch on here. And again, the rule of law seems to be core there, because it's all about what is the process that you apply to actually prevent violence to happen. And I think, again, without rule of law, you will have a process that might not be seen as due process, and you might actually have huge violations of civil liberties, and hence you have another problem on the occasion. So I would, anyway, just emphasize the importance of rule of law in all of this, while again emphasizing again that we do have to start looking at new ways of actually approaching those issues and take.
Do you have a suggestion on a new way?
Well, as I said, I think the ambassador made a clear point, is that we lack the intelligence quite often. And I think, a lot of that debate is about what would you do if something happens. And it seems to me that we are in an environment, especially with the asymmetric threats, and especially with a threat like nuclear, where you cannot have the luxury of thinking about what would happen. That it should be really about how do you prevent, to a certain extent, something from happening. And in that context, intelligence is key. And so the question then is, of course, how do you actually get the intelligence in a manner that that allows for decision making that deals with root causes, that deals with free riders in a manner that they actually can prevent something. And here, what I want to emphasize is here you can have a whole set of new ways of gathering the intelligence due to innovations in information technology that you didn't have before. So I think you have to start looking into how can you improve that.
Unfortunately, I think in a lot of these cases, it really relies on the goodwill of the international, a unified international community, not a unified Security Council, not necessarily a divided Security Council, to be able to, compel all of the players to actually toe the line and do the right thing in terms of the rule of law or any other aspect of most of these agreements. Let's go to the floor, and are there any questions? I'm having a little difficulty seeing folks with this light, but
There's a question over here.
yes? Wait for the microphone, and then please identify yourself, and a question, please, and not just a statement.
Yeah, absolutely. I have only questions and no answers, David. I'm Michelle Dennedy. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer at McAfee. I kind of sit at the precipice of this very issue at McAfee as the privacy officer providing security solutions. And my question is really primarily to the ambassador, but to any of the panelists of, at the same time, we recognize the need for better and better security data, and we need facts to support our decision making. I mean, the Bay of Pigs is a perfect example of bad data and insecure data, both of them with tragic results, obviously. So what is the pressure, perhaps, that the UN or other bodies can play in talking to, as we go through this revision of a possible regulation, a data regulation that does not have specific caveats and allowances for security data and intelligence data? Instead, we're scratching at the edges and begging for safe harbors and exceptions to the rule, rather than saying, yes, all the marketing stuff and all of the behavioral targeting is bad, but what is it? What is an acceptable use for the international good?
Anybody?
From one angle, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm approaching from a slightly different angle than your original intention is. And the angle is information about where arms races might be going, like sub-regional arms races, like South Asia, for example. And there might be a couple of ongoing arms races in Asia. There is a map I will not show. It's about which countries are missing from the ratifiers of the Test Ban Treaty. It's Asia, Middle East. US has a Pacific interest. And it's important that there is no overestimation of where things might be going. The right information is made available, and this is where transparency verification can be relevant. This is where, for example, not just understanding the data right, but understanding the behavior right is important. This is why it's not us who potentially should be begging some of the countries, like South Asia, please join this treaty. It's in their own interest to do that. Why? Just to give you one example, taking a complex situation with the letter B, biological. There are so many endemic diseases in South Asia. If there is any misunderstanding about the origin of a disease which is suddenly popping up, and the accusation is that this is not endemic, this is something which was done by a sub-state group, and the reaction to that, or another issue, if we don't understand fully what is the situation with fissile material, for example, in the same region. There is an increasing amount of fissile material, and we should speak about the plutonium economy if there will be enough time about that. At least I would like to flag it. If there is no understanding about inventories and what is belonging where, again, a dirty bomb type of scenario, Mumbai plus, with all the consequences. So it's extremely important that we have certain transparency, verification, inventories, clarity, and rules of behavior. So again, we cannot be in a bumper car entertainment car in the 21st century because of the danger of those technologies and the complexity. Because B can come together with A, the nuclear. So if there is an action demanded, by the media, by the public, as a result of something which is perceived a terrorist threat, it's very difficult for any politician to stand up and to prevent it. It happened, fortunately, in 2001, but who knows?
Yes, please.
Just very briefly, from my perspective, as I've spoken about accountability, which is a very different context, but you've mentioned the United Nations, the importance for us of getting information after events have occurred in order to bring about accountability, to which we are so highly principally wedded, is actually very, very difficult, as you can imagine, in circumstances. But in order for there to be accountability, we have to have facts. And this poses us enormous challenges. I mean, we can just think in the last couple of years between the Democratic Republic of Congo, things that have happened there, Sri Lanka, the terrible events that occurred in Sri Lanka, Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, etc. And Guinea, it was a really particularly difficult situation for us, where a series of events occurred, and then it became necessary to put in place an accountability national justice or international justice system. But in order for that to have validity, there has to be an appropriate amount of evidence and sufficient evidence, and that is very, very challenging for us. We set up commissions of inquiry, and these can, as those who have followed any of those situations, provoke real difficulties. Or the flotilla incident, for example, or the Gaza incident soon after I became the legal counsel. All of these incidents and events create a real difficulty in terms of establishing the facts, because people have different perspectives on facts, but garnering information is a challenge for the UN.
Yeah, again, I mean, I totally agree with that. It's very hard to get the facts quite often. But again, I don't want to be the naive utopian person here, but I do want us to push us that actually, meaning if you imagine that, for instance, if you look at Africa, where there is a high penetration of mobile phones, for instance, I mean, you have a whole different information platform that you can actually start engaging to get some facts that you otherwise would not have, especially in areas like Congo, for instance. So I think we have to force ourselves. I mean, and I know all the limitations, and I'm easy to. I don't have the responsibility that the people here at the table carry, but we have to force ourselves to go beyond what we have done in the past and really look at what are the tools that we have these days to actually get the fact that you otherwise might not have. Now, on the specific question, the problem with data quite often is that we are also using an old paradigm that focuses on collection. And that's the problem, is that we have to start shifting the paradigm of how do you control collection to a paradigm to how do you control use. And then you can start listing certain kinds of uses that actually you want to enable for the public interest and to serving a public good. And then you want to develop a concept of authorized use, i.e. that only those who actually have a permission to actually and have a mission to use that data, that they have access to that data. And by the way, that would have prevented WikiLeaks. So that's, anyway, that's the paradigm that we have to go to.
Anyone else? Someone else? No? I want to ask each one of us, before we wind up, we still have 8 minutes. I'd like each of you to tell me what is the likelihood that Iran will develop a nuclear weapon, and what might the response of Israel be, or the United States for that matter, and how can we best keep them from doing that, or should we keep them from doing that? Each one of you spend a couple minutes, or a minute or so, talking about that, if you like.
May I start?
Yes. Yes.
I'm going to start by saying that from the Legal Counsel of the United Nations perspective, I'm going to say little or nothing about this.
Okay.
So thank you very much. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult topic.
Yes. I'll be a little more adventurous, but I understand the situation. I think that we have to see it again in the context of the NPT treaty. And Iran being an adherent, it ratified the NPT treaty, and it basically feels that there is a disharmony, if I can say that, between those countries that are members of the NPT and those that are not, that are declared outside and declared nuclear weapon powers, as well as one which we have talked about, and that is Israel. Now, one of the underlying tenets of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is also nuclear disarmament. That was basically the signature means that you have an undertaking that you actually have nuclear disarmament. And that is something that has been sadly lacking from the whole. I mean, there's been monitoring, there has been evaluation, there have been restrictions, but there hasn't actually been nuclear disarmament. Now, let me qualify that, because if you talk to the United States and the Russian Federation, they will say that the New START last year was actually a good effort in that direction. But on the other hand, what had also happened, and that we have to be very clear about, is that it eliminated nuclear weapons that were basically obsolete, but it also resulted in a modernization cycle that's actually very expensive. But on the other hand, that was the US and that was the Russian Federation. That did not involve the other ones, the other three nuclear powers. And I think it is very hard to sort of say, well, we're a good member of a member in good standing of the NPT, but on the other hand, that particular tenet has not been fulfilled. And that is an opinion that is very vociferously voiced, not only by Iran, but also by some other member states who have voluntarily renounced nuclear weapons by being adhering to the nuclear weapons. So I think
you're suggesting that they probably will develop a nuclear weapon then, no?
I'm sorry?
You're suggesting that they probably will wind up
I'm not
developing.
suggesting anything. I'm saying that what they should do is they should be more open to monitoring and verification. Because I think what is really needed now is confidence-building measures. Confidence-building measures in the international community that Iran is not doing anything that might lead to the development or that might use nuclear energy or nuclear material for military purposes. I think that is what is needed. I think the Secretary General has also been very vocal and very public about this in terms of underlining that. But so far we have not seen that. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Organization, just issued a report card, if I can call it that, where they basically declared that they did not have the confidence that that was actually not happening. Thank you.
You're closest probably to anybody for that. You're the safety net, I think you were telling me before.
Let me be more adventurous then.
Okay.
And I'm adventurous because I'm venturing in an area which is you are the authority. This is the pre-First World War era. Naval arms race. So if you try to recall the naval arms race between Germany and Britain, and you try to visualize, N stands for naval, but the narrative which was deployed from the 1890s onward is extremely close to the narrative which is deployed nowadays. So narrative number one, this used to be the Germany narrative. I do have as much right to an ocean-going navy as anyone else. And the other narrative was Britain saying that, look, you are endangering my security feeling because I'm an island state, Britain, and all the links of my communication, my lifeline, is dependent on how I perceive the right proportion between your navy and my navy. For the information of those who did not follow, the naval was practically not used at the level of the dreadnoughts, which practically manifested this arms race. But yes, it was one of the factors which was a catalyst leading not just the two empires, but another three, altogether 5 empires, into a big calamity, which ended with practically many of them coming down right in 1918. And for Britain, it was a beginning of another era. An interesting point, 1912, there was set the first and the last negotiation Germany and Britain ever had on the naval arms race. Only one. And in these negotiations, this is called, I think, the Hedelmann Mission, practically Germany wanted, through von Tirpitz, a ratio between the German fleet and the British fleet, 75 to 100. And the British perception was, no, it has to be 50 to 100. You understand that the mid-ground between these two is 66, 2/3. And they did not agree. Why? Because I don't think the intention was to agree. They walked away from the table. Germany came down as an empire. Until 1898, it was not reconstituted. And Britain, and what was interesting, by the eve of the First World War, the proportion between the two navies was 66% to 100.
Which led to the First World War. But let me make one final effort to draw you into this, Patricia, if I could. These are laws that are being, in theory, violated, if the verification is true. Isn't it the obligation of the United Nations or the international community to enforce these treaties, which have the force of law?
Well, through the IAEA, of course.
Right.
Through the IAEA, the monitoring is continuing, and we know what the results of these reports are, and they're very alarming, very concerning. There's no question about that. But I mean, the area, from a legal perspective, of course, that's the case. But the sensitive legal issues are, what's going to be done about it.
Right, the consequence, right.
And that's not something. I mean, the United Nations follows. In fact, as Angela has mentioned, the Secretary General has been very, very firm and very clear about this, that he has sought every opportunity to encourage and exhort the Iranians to comply with their obligations and all of that. But he also, I think it would be interesting for those who are interested to listen to his upcoming speech on Tuesday at the General Assembly, his opening speech, where he will be dealing with a lot of critical issues that are currently on the table.
Have you seen a draft?
I won't answer that.
A little
I won't
advance.
answer that, but I think it will be an interesting moment to hear the voice of the UN.
Okay. Stefan, same question. Is Iran going to get a nuclear weapon ultimately, and what does Israel do about it, and what does the international community do
Well,
about it?
I don't really have anything to add to the expertise that is at the table, except for saying that there are some interesting ideas out there. For instance, you have Abe Sofar at the Hoover Institution, who just Abe Sofar
right.
at Hoover Institution, who just launched a book which is called "Taking on Iran," in which actually he emphasizes that the focus should be also on actually making the Revolutionary Guard more accountable, actually using legal instruments to making them accountable for actions that they might do outside of Iran. And so to add pressure to what is already added, but obviously, it's such a complex undertaking that I think no one has the solution. Otherwise, the problem would be solved.
See, I think we may all be dependent on the fact of whether, in fact, the regime of the Ayatollahs is a rational regime,
right.
and whether they understand the consequences of violation of this, the ultimate consequences of their using a nuclear weapon in some fashion
right.
On their people and their country, and that, I think, is something that perhaps may never be known until, it comes to a test. So, we are now at 10:17. I've been told we need to break up at 10:15, so, it's within 2 minutes, right, my 2-minute boundary. I'm not sure that we have actually solved all of the problems of symmetrical or asymmetrical threats, but I think we've had some interesting ideas proposed, and perhaps some folks will have a chance in Washington or across town here in the next week or so to have a listen to these, and perhaps we'll have had some impact. And so thank you all very much, Angela, Mr. Ambassador, Patricia, and Stefan, and thank all of you out there for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.